Greetings, grade 10 learners. This is a reflection on the general journal. Please note that the PowerPoint does not replace your notes, and you still need to use this in conjunction with your notes. The purpose is to understand the circumstances under which the general journal is used. What you should have learned is that the journal does not record all entries, and by process of elimination, you need to rule out any transaction that is not a cash transaction, credit sale or credit purchase, or where goods or refunds were either given or requested. The journal only records those transactions that do not occur often and therefore do not require its own specific journal. What is the process? We read the transaction, we identify the accounts involved, we analyze what is happening in the transaction and enter into the general journal, and lastly, we supply the narration. We were going to start, as per the notes, with our first transaction, which is bad debts. Bad debts is when a debtor cannot pay what they owe the business. We therefore write them off as not being able to pay, and we incur it as an expense. Bad debts is therefore an expense, and the accounts affected are bad debts, which we debit, and debtors control, which we credit. When we enter into a general journal, any transaction that we enter, we always start with the account that is debited first. Therefore, as you can see, it's bad debts. In our general debit column, we write 500 Rand, and we credit debtors control, or the name of the debtor, which is A Apple. And the reason we credit is because that debtor does not owe us the money anymore. As you can see in the debtors control column of the general journal, we also write 500 Rand in the credit column. And then lastly is our narration, which is debt is written off as irrecoverable. We then move on to an extension of bad debts, but in this case, the debtor is able to pay a portion of what they owe. The debtor in this example is B Banana. His estate can pay 40 cents in the Rand, and the balance he will have to be written off as a bad debt. So again, we follow the same procedure. The debited account, which is bad debts, we only write off the portion that is irrecoverable. The balance of what he owes, which is the 200 Rand, that would be entered in the cash receipts journal because he is paying that portion. The bad debt is written off in the general journal, and we follow the same process as the last transaction. Moving on, if the owner takes trading stock for his own personal use, remember that here the owner is not taking cash, he is taking trading stock. So therefore, we cannot enter this into the cash payments journal. If you look at the transaction, the owner has taken goods worth 200 Rand for his personal use. So therefore, the one account that is affected is drawings, and that is debited, and the other account is trading stock because we are removing that trading stock from our shelves. Therefore, drawings is debited, trading stock is credited, and as you can see, we only enter the amounts in the debit and credit column. We write our narration, and if we look at debtors control or creditors control, these columns are not affected because those accounts were not affected in the transaction. We therefore do not use the debtors and creditors control columns. Moving on, you will look at our next transaction, which is when we charge interest to a debtor that is overdue. So in this case, our debtor owed us interest of 5 Rand. So we need to add that to our debtors control because the debtor still owes it to us. Debtors control is therefore debited, and our interest is regarded as an income and is credited. So again, we start with the name of the debtor, which is O Orange. He is debited. Our interest income is credited. Okay, so that gets entered into our general columns. And then because debtors control is affected, we also use the debtors control column where we debit the debtors account. We also could be charged interest by a supplier, in which case the interest is an expense to us, and therefore in this case, the interest expense is debited, and our supplier, Fresh Fruit Farms, or our creditor, he is then credited. So again, the amount of R6 gets entered into our debit and credit columns, but because it is increasing the amount we owe to the creditor, we also enter the transaction in the creditor's control column. Moving on to a dishonored check. Remember that a dishonored check only occurs when we receive a check from a debtor that has bounced. We therefore have to cancel the check that we have received. The cancelled check is entered into the CPJ, but we also need to account for the discount we might have allowed the debtor. In this case, we've got to cancel the discount allowed, so therefore the discount must get added back to what the debtor owes us. Therefore, we debit debtor's control in the name of the debtor, which is G Grape, and we cancel the discount allowed by crediting discount allowed. So again, we will see the process of entering into the general journal, debit our debtor, credit discount allowed. We enter into the general columns for the debit and credit. And because it is affecting debtor's control in that we are adding the discount allowed back, we therefore need to write the amount in the debit column of debtor's control and then provide our narration. If we look at our last lot of transactions, we are going to start off by looking at corrections of errors. In this case, it might have been information that was entered incorrectly. For example, we might have purchased a vehicle on credit from VW Motors, but we actually entered it into the creditor's ledger of BMW. So we now have to reverse that transaction. So how do we reverse a transaction for a creditor? We need to take away the amount from BMW Motors. So we therefore debit BMW Motors creditor's control. And we now need to add it to VW Motors. So we will now credit VW Motors, and which will affect creditor's control. So if we look at our general journal, our debit account is always written first, and then we have our VW Motors, which is credited. We enter into the general columns, so debit 80,000, and then for BMW Motors, and then credit 80,000 for VW Motors. But we also have to show the effect on the creditor's control account. So we need to show that the one creditor is being decreased by 80,000, which is BMW, and the other creditor, which is VW Motors, is being credited. We have to show the effect so that we can show how the effect cancels each other out in the creditor's control account. Okay, then we have to show at the end of the month we would total our debit column in the creditor's control account, and we would total the credit column of the creditor's control account so that we can post it to the ledger, and we would also provide a narration. Moving on to another correction of error, we could have a debtor, CAB, who paid his account of 500 Rand, but this amount was posted to the account of BAC in the creditor's ledger and credited. So therefore, BAC has 500 Rand too much. So we need to take it away. We would therefore debit BAC in our creditor's control to take away the 500 Rand, and we would credit CAB in the debtor's control because that is where the debtor actually paid us the 500 Rand that he owes. So we now need to show that the debtor has paid off that amount by crediting his account. So again, we start with the account we need to debit, which is BAC, with 500 Rand, and we need to show the effect in the creditor's control account, and therefore it is a debit. We then show the effect on CAB, which is our debtor, and it's a credit entry in our general journal, but the effect in debtors control would also be a credit of 500 Rand, and we would provide our narration. Another correction of error we could have is if we mistakenly post materials that we bought, for example, to the stationery account. That means we should have entered the money into packing material, but we entered it into stationery instead. So we now have to reverse the entry. So we would then debit packing material and we would credit stationery in order to show the cancellation of the money in stationery and adding it to the correct account, which is packing material. So again, you would start with your debit account, and which is packing material, your credited account, which is stationery, because we're taking it away from stationery, and you would show the effect in the debit and credit column. Again, note that the debtors control and creditors control columns are not used as they are not affected. Moving on, our last correction of error could be the incorrect entry of an amount. So for example, we could have had equipment costing 650 Rand purchased from a creditor, but it was in error posted in the CJ as 560 Rand. Therefore, we need to find what is the difference. The correct amount is 650, but we entered it as 560. So we subtract the two amounts and the difference is 90 Rand. So we need to add a further 90 Rand to equipment and a further 90 Rand to our creditors control because we put too little money into our books. So we now have to add only the difference between the two amounts. So again, equipment is debited, Coolit services or our creditors control is credited. We show the entry in the general debit and credit columns. And because Coolit services is a creditor, we also show the effect in creditors control. Our last set of transactions are regarded as transfer of balances. And what this means is that a debtor of the business can also be a creditor, or a creditor could also be a debtor. And the way in which we would carry out a transaction such as this is that we always transfer the account with the smallest balance to the account with the greater balance. So in this case, Figaro is a debtor. He owes the business 400 Rand, and we need to transfer this to his balance in his account in the creditors ledger. So in this case, we basically are saying that he owes us, the business, 400 Rand, but we as the business also owe him money. So instead of him paying us the entire 400 Rand, we're just going to take it away from whatever we owe him. So we would debit Figaro as the creditor to take it away from what we owe him, and then we would credit Figaro as the debtor because he therefore does not owe us this money anymore. So we would put in Figaro as the creditor. We would debit his account in the creditor's ledger with 400 Rand. Okay, and then the effect in creditors control is that it would be a debit. And then Figaro, the debtor, is credited, and the effect on debtors control is that it is credited. Okay, and our reason is a transfer of balances. We could also have, in the case of our creditor Dante, he has a debit balance of 200 Rand in his account in the debtor's ledger. So basically, the creditor's ledger has a debit balance because the business could have overpaid the account, and now the creditor owes the business, which is the money that was overpaid. So we would then debit Dante's account in the debtor's control and credit his account in the creditor's control. okay, to account for the overpayment because we now owe him the money. Okay, so it's a debit to debtors control and then a credit to creditors control. Our last few transactions are also entered into the general journal. I'm just very briefly going to explain them, but when we are back at school, we are actually going to focus on this a little bit more. So what the focus is on here is how to capitalize interest. So interest could either be charged on a loan or it could be earned on the fixed deposit. In this case, we are looking at interest that is charged on a loan. And in basic terms, interest, for example, on a mortgage bond, in most cases, the interest is capitalized, meaning it's added back to the capital amount of the loan. So the interest isn't necessarily paid every year, but it's calculated and added on to the capital. So when it is capitalized, it is added to the amount owing on the actual loan, and a journal entry needs to be made. So again, the general journal would record this. So in this transaction, the loan statement received from AUB Bank reflected an amount of 4,500 Rand being interest payable for the year, and interest on the loan is capitalized. So we don't show the payment of the interest, we show how the interest is added back to the loan. So the two accounts affected would be interest on loan, which we are debiting because that's our expense, and we would credit our loan account, which is loan from AUB Bank, because that is our liability and we are adding the interest to that liability. So we reflect interest and loan as the debit, loan as the credit, and we only enter this into the general debit and credit columns. On the other hand, you could also earn interest on a fixed deposit. And again, the proceeds of what we have earned on the fixed deposit, we might opt to add it back to the capital amount. So in this case, the interest is reinvested rather than us receiving the money into our bank account. So we would debit our fixed deposit account because that is our asset and our asset is increasing with the interest that we earn. And we credit our interest on fixed deposit because that is the income that we eventually will earn from this fixed deposit. So if we look at how we enter into the general journal, our fixed deposit is debited, our interest is credited, and we only enter the amounts into the general debit and credit columns. Okay, and then bad debts recovered. Please note that this has nothing to do with debtors. Bad debts recovered is income that you earn from a debtor who was previously written off and they have now come back to pay some or all of what they owe. It has nothing to do with debtors because you've already written them off. So you can't go back and change your debtors control account. So the amount that we receive is recorded in the CRJ. No amount is entered into the debtors control section of the CRJ, and we also don't enter this into the general journal. And the reason for that is because bad debts recovered is cash we are receiving, and cash received must be entered into the cash receipts journal. So for example, a debtor CCAT who had previously been written off now pays us 1,000 Rand. So as you can see, we've drawn up our cash receipts journal. We enter into bank, and then in sundry accounts, we also enter the amount of 1,000 Rand, and we call it bad debts recovered. Just to have a look at the general ledger, this is going to become very important when we start doing control accounts, but please remember that from our general journal, the debtors control columns, at the end of the month, you will add up everything in the debit column and you will add up everything in the credit column, and you will post these to the debtors control account. So as you can see, the debit column added up to 10 Rand at the end of May. So we write that as journal debits and we enter it as 10 Rand in the general ledger. The credit column of the debtors control also gets added up at the end of the month. In this case, it was 134 Rand, and we enter that on the credit side of debtors control and post the amount as well, and we call it journal credits. Please remember, this does not replace any other entries that we have learnt about for debtors control. It is merely an additional entry because now we are working with the general journal, but we will still post from the debtors journal, the debtors allowance journal, and the CRJ and CPJ when posting to debtors control. If we look at creditors control, it is the same application. We would have the creditors control columns from our general journal. The debit column and the credit column would be added up at the end of the month. In this case, creditors control had a credit total of 6 Rand, and that gets written on the credit side, and we call it journal credits, and the amount of 6 Rand gets entered. We also add up the debit column of 100 Rand. This would go on the debit side of creditors control, and the amount of 100 Rand gets entered. In the same way, this does not cancel out anything else we have learned about creditors control. We still need to enter from the creditors journal and the creditors allowances journal and the cash payments journal when we are drawing up the creditors control account. What are your next steps? You need to read through your notes again. The PowerPoint and the video that we have made must be used in conjunction with the notes. If you prefer not to use the video, I will also post the PowerPoint in Google Classrooms for you to use in conjunction with your notes. You need to try the exercises again and ask questions as much as you can. We have now reached the end of this presentation. Grade 10s, I hope that you use this to your advantage, and please let Mrs. Hines and I know should you require any further assistance. Thank you.